I'm going to be showing you about why I choose certain papers and what certain papers do. I'm going to show you what each petal looks like on the different papers, and I hope this is going to be useful to you and maybe help you make a choice, because the reason why I choose something may not be a perfect fit for you. Shall we get started?
It can be very daunting to know what to use. There are 3 different paper surfaces. The first is hot press paper. That's a very smooth paper. Another paper you can actually buy is rough watercolour paper, which is lovely for loose expressive paintings here. And as you can see, you get the same details. 300 grams, 100% cotton, and it says it's a rough surface. Paper I recommend is cold press. It's also called knot, meaning not hot press. So it's got a bit of texture. It's perfect for beginners. I also recommend you getting 100% cotton paper because it doesn't dry as quickly, and especially for beginners it gives you more time, which is so important when you're starting out. In watercolor I recommend 300 grams, which this pad is. So they're the things you would need to look out for when you are buying your watercolor paper.
So I have 3 different types of paper here. I've got hot pressed, rough and cold pressed. So this is the rough paper. It's Saunders Waterford, 300 grams. And I'm just drawing just a couple of petals just to give you an idea of what rough paper is like. Now, rough paper has got a very textured surface. I recommend it for landscape paintings, something where you want lots of texture. One thing I find about it when you use it for flower painting is because it's got so much texture, it doesn't sort of move as well as maybe cold pressed or hot pressed paper. As you can see there, I didn't quite wet it enough there because you've got to really make sure you wet the paper with rough paper because it's so textured. You can miss bits, but I love it though. I mean, it's a really nice paper and it creates really interesting effects. And as you can see there, it looks quite nice. So I'm just putting on some darks now as well, just really trying out the paper. I think the main thing with rough paper is it kind of resists your brush a bit, and when you're painting details like flowers, even if it's, I mean, especially if it was botanical, you may find that a little bit tricky, but it's lovely for landscapes, if you really want that texture, I would definitely recommend rough paper, but it gives you an idea what the paper does here. I was just using my twig there just to kind of scratch into the paper, and it works quite well doing that as well. So I'm using the cold press paper now, 300 grams, Saunders Waterford. It's in a spiral pad form here, which I quite like. It's a really nice brand actually, Saunders Waterford, and I've used it for many years. I usually use mostly rough and the knot surface. And I'm just finding here now, painting this little petal, that it's going on beautifully. It's sort of flowed quite well, and you can see that that sort of tonal contrast at the top there's worked well. It's not resisting my brush as much as the rough paper because of the details of the flower. So all in all, I quite like this, but there's so much control here with the knot surface. I'm really feeling that. And there you go, you can see a close-up there, it looks quite good. So onto the hot press now. I've drawn it in and I'm just going to paint now wet in wet using the tip of my brush. I tried to use similar techniques for each of the petals so it doesn't look like I've tried to do a different technique. So I'm painting here wet in wet and dropping the paint in. And as you can see there, it kind of flows a bit better, especially than the rough paper. It flows down. It almost flows too well, if you see what I mean. What I do love about hot press paper is that you do get a lot more happy accidents, or maybe unhappy as well. It does create some interesting textures, especially if the wash is drying and you drop water or paint in that's wetter. It gives you amazing backgrounds. As you saw there, I used the twig, and actually I will say that the twig performs best on hot press paper. It really does scratch into the paper really well. There's nothing to resist it. You can imagine it's such smooth paper. I mean, obviously the cold press is the good compromise. So if I was to say, if you're starting out in watercolor and you want to know what paper to get, get yourself some cold press to start with, and then you can sort of play around with the rough and the smooth. So what I'm doing now is I'm painting wet on dry just to see how the paint performs on the hot press paper, and it performs really well actually. I mean, it's really nice. It goes on smoothly. You can get that detail that you want with these flowers. It allows you to do that, you know, to apply the paint on. It's smooth, it's easy, and obviously it's very responsive to the twig as well. So I'm just putting a little bit of detail now into the center as well. Again, I find it quite easy to paint detail with this paper. I'm using a size 6 brush, and the paint really kind of glides along because it's got nothing to resist it. You know, there's no texture on this paper at all. It's lovely and smooth. I do enjoy this paper because of the wonderful effects you can have when you drop in wet paint or wet water into a drying wash. As you can see there's a back run already forming, and there I pointed out where that green has just slid down. It sort of slides the hot press paper. Now, I would say sometimes as a beginner you might find that difficult to control, or thinking, why is this happening? And that's because the paper is smooth and it hasn't got anything to stop it moving. As in the rough or even the knot surface, it's got that texture that stops it from running away from you. So as you can see here, me holding it up to the camera, that puddle has just sort of skidded off the petal and run onto the background. And that's the kind of thing that does happen with hot press. You have to be quite careful. So here we are, all 3 in a row, and I like the effects of the middle one with the texture with the hot pressed. I would say actually the rough I like the least, and I really like the knot surface as well. So if you've got a close up here of the rough and the hot pressed, you can see the textures and the back runs and everything yummy in that hot press paper, and it's a little bit flatter in the rough. But equally at the edges of the hot press, you can see I lost control because it slid off the petal, as it were. So, you know, you've got to be extra careful. Whereas you look on the cold press paper, there's a lot more control, but there's also some texture.
I thought it'd be useful to share with you another example of painting the same subject on these 3 different paper surfaces. As you can see, the rough's very loose and the hot press is quite detailed, and you've got sort of a mixture of both with the cold press. So I really hope this has given you a little bit more insight into the type of watercolour papers. Of course, there are different manufacturers out there creating different sort of surfaces as well, but my recommendation would be to choose a 300 grams 100% cotton paper with a cold pressed surface. If you have any questions about this tutorial, please put them in the comments section. And if you'd like to support the tutorials that I create here on YouTube, why not think about supporting me on my Patreon membership? Details about the membership can be found in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.